3 o'clock. The Hindu Kush. A massive operation involving 480 SEALs is spiraling into a nightmare. A tiny communication lag turned a routine exfiltration into a lethal bottleneck. 400 men are trapped in a narrow valley, the exit routes closing fast. One position must be held to let the others breathe, to let the group slip away into the night. One woman steps into the gap. She keys her radio for the last time. Static. Silence. In the morning report, she is listed as lost in action. But when the rescue birds finally land, the discovery changes everything. The truth finally surfaces from mountain dust. The civilian world often measures a person by their volume or the flashiness of their resume. In the high-speed, ego-driven environment of special operations, those who don't shout are often seen as those who don't have anything to say. Senior medic Lena Cross, 31 years old, was the embodiment of that silence. She had been attached to specialized naval units for nearly 8 years. Yet if you ask the younger SEALs in the barracks at Little Creek, few could tell you anything about her personal life. She arrived 10 minutes early for every briefing, her gear always meticulously organized, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Lena didn't spend her downtime in the gym trying to outlift the Tier 1 operators. She spent her time in the supply hangar, methodically checking the expiration dates on every single dose of TXA, a clotting agent, and calibrating portable ultrasound machines that most people forgot existed until someone was bleeding out. She was the one who memorized the blood types of every single man in the 480-person task force. She knew which sailor had a lingering meniscus injury from a previous jump and which officer was prone to altitude sickness above 10,000 feet. To the elite warriors, she was just the medic, a necessary but essentially invisible part of the logistical tale. Cross is reliable, but she's not exactly a game changer. A cocky young lieutenant had once remarked during a cold weather training exercise in Alaska. She's there to patch us up after the fight, not to win it. She doesn't have the killer instinct you need for the red zone. Lena had heard the whispers through the thin walls of the command tents, but she never flinched. She didn't need their validation. She needed their survival. She understood a truth that the younger men often forgot in the heat of their training. In a high-pressure environment, the person who sees the most is usually the one who talks the least. While the commanders focused on primary objectives and kinetic engagement, Lena was focused on the human infrastructure. She was constantly scanning the formation, watching the way a point man's shoulders slumped from heat exhaustion, listening to the specific labored rhythm of breathing that signaled a crash was coming. She treated her medical bag like a sacred object. Inside, every tourniquet was staged for one-handed application. Every chest seal was placed exactly where her hand would reach in total darkness. She practiced blind drills, closing her eyes and assembling a specialized airway kit in under 20 seconds. To the SEALs, she was the person who handed out ibuprofen and hydration salts. They didn't see the woman who was preparing for the worst-case scenario every minute of every day. The current operation, codenamed Iron Sieve, was a masterpiece of tactical complexity. It involved multiple SEAL platoons, Ranger elements, and support teams moving in synchronized waves across a series of jagged volcanic ridges near the border. The goal was to dismantle a decentralized insurgency network before they could mobilize for a spring offensive. For the first 48 hours, the mission was a textbook success. But on the third night, the environment, the one factor you can never truly control, decided to intervene. The barometric pressure dropped with a sickening speed. A localized sandstorm, thick with mineral-heavy dust, began to whip through the narrow canyons. The high iron content in the rocks began to bounce the GPS signals, creating a displacement error that made digital maps flicker and die. Suddenly, the 480 men weren't a cohesive wave. They were becoming fragmented clusters, lost in a vertical labyrinth of shadow and grit. Lena was positioned at the rear of the largest element, carrying a 70-pound rucksack filled with enough trauma gear to run a small field hospital. She saw the confusion starting to set in through her night vision goggles. She saw the squad leaders shaking their devices, then looking at the horizon in a silent panic. She realized, seconds before anyone else, that they were walking into a topographical trap. The primary extraction point was being swallowed by the storm, and the only other viable route out was a narrow mountain pass that acted as a natural funnel. If 480 men tried to push through that 10-foot gap simultaneously in a state of disorganized retreat, they would create a lethal bottleneck. They would be exposed, bunched up, and utterly vulnerable to even the smallest harassing fire from the ridges above. The mission wasn't just in jeopardy. The lives of every elite operator on the ground were hanging by a thread. And yet, to the men rushing past her, Lena was still just the medic. They were looking for a general with a booming voice to save them, completely unaware that the only person with a clear plan was currently tightening the straps on her medical kit in the dust at the rear of the line. If you think support roles are often underestimated, comment, "It's unfair." The situation transitioned from concerning to tactical disaster in under 7 minutes. The radio network was a chaotic mess of overlapping voices, digital static, and frantic status updates. The commander's voice, usually a model of calm authority, crackled through the comms with a jagged edge. "All units, pivot to the secondary exit at Grid 7. We need to clear the valley floor before the sun hits the ridge. If we get caught in that wash when the light breaks, we're black on all options." But Lena was looking at the actual ground, not the flickering blue dots on a screen. She saw the bottleneck forming at the entrance to the pass. 3 different platoons were converging on the single, narrow gap. Behind them, the simulated opposing force, highly trained evaluators who were playing the enemy for this high-stakes certification, were closing the distance with terrifying speed. In a real combat scenario, this was exactly where a massacre would occur. "Command, this is Medic Cross," Lena said, her voice a calm, flat frequency that stood out like a lighthouse beam against the frantic shouting on the net. "The Grid 7 exit is blocked by the formation density. We have a buildup. If we don't hold the hinge at the southern ridge, the trailing elements will be cut off and fixed in place." There was a long, agonizing pause on the radio. Back at the base, the commander was looking at a digital map that showed the 480 men as a cohesive unit. He couldn't feel the grit in the air or see the physical reality of the bottleneck. "Cross, what's your assessment? We don't have the manpower to leave a full squad behind for a rearguard action. We need everyone at the pad." "We don't need a squad, sir," Lena replied. Her hands were already moving, checking her secondary beacon. "We need an anchor, someone to stay at the hinge, direct the flow of the groups into the pass, and monitor the rear perimeter. If I stay, I can keep the trunk clear and ensure no one gets left behind in the dust. I have the overwatch on the entrance. I can manage the flow." The room in the command tent went silent. They knew what she was asking. To stay at the hinge meant being the last person out of a closing trap. It meant being the only person between 480 men and the simulated chaos closing in from the rear. It was a position of maximum exposure with zero safety net. "Cross, you're a medic," the commander said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your job is at the extraction point with the primary surgical team." "My job is the health of this unit, sir," Lena countered, her voice never wavering. "And if we don't manage this bottleneck, I'll have 400 casualties to treat instead of 0. I'll hold the hinge. Just make sure the birds are hot and ready when the last man is through." She didn't wait for a formal debate or a signed order. She dropped her heavy rucksack, keeping only her primary trauma kit, her sidearm, and a specialized laser designator. She took a position on a small outcrop of rock that overlooked the entrance to the mountain pass. As the SEAL teams began to funnel through, Lena became a human traffic controller for the dying. The dust was now so thick it tasted like copper. Lena pulled her shemagh tighter around her face. She wasn't just watching for the enemy. She was watching the physics of the movement. She saw the way the heavy machine gunners were slowing down, their legs buckling. She coordinated the redistribution of their weight mid-movement, shouting over the roar of the wind. "Keep the rhythm," Lena commanded as a group of exhausted operators stumbled past her position. "Don't look back at the ridge. The exit is 400 yards ahead. Move! I have the rear." One by one, the groups slipped into the safety of the mountain pass. The bottleneck was being managed not by force, but by the quiet, surgical authority of a woman who understood the mechanics of a crisis. But as the number of men in the valley floor decreased, the threat to Lena increased exponentially. The enemy sensors were closing in. The sandstorm was peaking, turning the world into a wall of white noise. The young lieutenant who had dismissed her as just support was in the very last group. He stopped for a second, looking up at Lena, who stood alone on the rock, her figure a lone silhouette against the swirling sand. "Medic, you need to move now. There's no one left behind us but the shadows." "Go, Lieutenant," Lena said, her eyes already fixed on the horizon where the OPFOR was approaching. "I have the rear. I'll see you at the pad. Move your men." He hesitated for a heartbeat, seeing the absolute iron discipline in her stance. He realized in that moment that leadership wasn't about the trident on his chest. It was about the person willing to be the last one in the dark. He turned and ran into the pass. Lena keyed her mic. "Command. All 480 personnel are through the hinge. The valley floor is clear. I am transitioning to evasion. Wait. I have multiple contacts. Signal losing. The radio died. The anchor had gone dark. If you realize real leadership is choosing the harder position, comment. I was wrong." In the high-tech command center at the base, the silence was deafening. The digital icons for the 480 SEALs were all safely clustered at the extraction point, glowing blue and steady. But Lena's icon, the single white dot at the southern ridge, remained static. For 2 hours, the technicians tried to raise her on every emergency frequency. They sent drone sweeps over the area, but the mineral-heavy sandstorm had turned the valley into a total electronic blind spot. The morning report was drafted with a heavy hand by a commander who looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night. Specialist Lena Cross, missing in action, presumed lost. At the extraction point, the mood was somber, heavy with the weight of a debt that couldn't be repaid. The 480 men she had saved were sitting in the dust, waiting for the transport birds. There were no cheers for the successful mission. The lieutenant stood by the ramp of a Chinook, staring back toward the mountains as the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks. He remembered her face, not a face of fear, but of cold, focused intent. He realized that they were all breathing because she had chosen to stop breathing for a while. But Lena Cross wasn't interested in being a martyr. She was interested in the mission. When the radio had cut out, it wasn't because she was overrun by the OPFOR. It was because the electromagnetic interference of the storm had finally peaked, frying her short-range comms. Lena knew that if she stayed on that rock, she would be captured by the OPFOR sensors, and the unit would fail the entire certification. She also knew that if she tried to run into the pass now, she would draw the enemy directly onto the heels of the fleeing SEALs. She made the most difficult tactical decision of her career. She moved away from the exit. She utilized the dead zone logic she had studied in the topographical briefings. She knew that the OPFOR sensors were programmed to look for movement toward the extraction point. By moving deeper into the rocky crevices of the southern ridge, the exact opposite direction of safety, she became a ghost. This wasn't a movie fight. There were no explosions or slow-motion dives. It was a brutal, agonizing test of endurance. Lena crawled through narrow gaps in the volcanic rock, her fingers bleeding from the sharp edges of the basalt. She managed her body temperature by burying herself in the cool sand under a granite overhang during the peak of the day's heat. She moved only when the shadows were long and the air was still. She practiced sensory management, a technique she learned in SEER school. She slowed her heart rate to 45 beats per minute, minimizing her oxygen consumption. She used her medical training on herself, treating the deep lacerations on her hands and legs with the last of her sterile wipes and a specialized adhesive she had tucked into her pocket. Every hour she performed a mental check of the unit's manifest, reciting the 480 names to keep her mind sharp, to keep from drifting into the cold apathy of exhaustion. "The unit is safe," she whispered to the darkness of her small survival hide. "The mission is success. Everything else is just noise." For 36 hours, Lena existed in the margins of existence. Back at the base, her gear locker was being processed. Her emergency contacts were being notified that she was missing. The 480 SEALs had been moved to a secondary location for debriefing, but none of them could focus on the tactical data. They kept talking about the medic, They kept talking about the way she held the light at the hinge while the world was falling apart. One veteran chief petty officer, a man who had survived 3 deployments and 5 Purple Hearts, stood up during the middle of the general's debrief. "We're not leaving her name on a black list," he growled, his voice vibrating with a suppressed fury. "The storm has cleared. The thermal sensors are back up. If she's out there, we go back. We don't care about the evaluation score. We don't care about the fuel budget. We go back for the anchor. Who's with me?" The commander looked at the 480 men who all stood up in unison behind the chief. He saw the shift in the culture of the unit. They weren't just a group of elite operators anymore. They were a brotherhood that finally understood the value of the tail. "Get the birds in the air," the commander ordered, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "We're going back to Grid 7. If you believe the hardest choices are often unseen, comment, 'I owe you.'" The sound of the rotors returning to the valley was like the rhythmic heartbeat of a giant. 3 Black Hawks swept low over the southern ridge, their infrared cameras scanning every crevice and shadow in the volcanic rock. The medics on board were prepared for the absolute worst. They had a black bag ready. They expected to find a body or a broken spirit, a casualty of the exposure and the isolation. They found neither. When the first medic, a young man who had trained under Lena, rappelled down to her last known coordinates, he didn't find a casualty. He found a masterpiece of tactical survival. Lena had used her trauma blankets and specialized mylar sheeting to create a thermal mass shelter under a deep shelf of granite. She had utilized the natural dead space of the ridge to stay invisible to both the OPFOR sensors and the overhead drone sweeps. She was sitting inside her hide, her back against the cool rock, her sidearm in her lap, and her signal mirror positioned to catch the first light of the rescue bird. She looked terrible. Her face was sun-scorched to a dark red. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her uniform was shredded from the basalt. But when the medic approached, she didn't scream or cry for help. She simply checked the time on his watch as he landed. "You're 12 hours late for the secondary pickup window," Lena said, her voice a dry, gravelly rasp that sounded like it came from the earth itself. The medic froze, his hand halfway to his medkit. "Lena, my God, we thought the sensors said you were overrun. The general marked you as lost. How did you stay under the radar for 2 days with no water and no comms?" "Discipline," Lena replied simply. She stood up, her legs shaking from pure exhaustion, but her posture remained firm. "I moved to the blind spot. I managed my metabolic rate. I waited for the frequency to clear. Is the unit secure? Did the exfiltration hold?" "The unit is fine, Lena," the medic whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and profound relief. "All 480 of them. They're back at the base, and they refused to leave until we found you." As they lifted her into the helicopter, the shocking discovery started to spread through the radio net. It wasn't just that she was alive, it was how she was alive. She hadn't survived by luck or by a miracle. She had survived by being better at the tactical game than the very people who had designed it. She had used her deep knowledge of human physiology and environmental physics to stay invisible when the entire world was looking for a corpse. But there was one more surprise. As the medic began to treat her for dehydration, Lena reached into her vest and pulled out a small, encrypted data drive. "While I was in the hide," she said, leaning her head back against the helicopter wall, "I recorded the movement patterns and sensor frequencies of the OPFOR teams. I also mapped the geothermal vents on this ridge. They provide a thermal signature that perfectly masks human body heat. If we ever have to establish a long-term surveillance post here, this is the location. Tell the commander, the mission has been updated." The medic stared at her. "You were missing for 2 days, presumed dead, and you were still collecting intelligence? You were building a tactical map of a place you shouldn't have been in?" "The mission doesn't end just because the radio does," Lena whispered. She closed her eyes as the bird lifted off the ridge. Her pulse was steady. Her breathing was shallow. Her job was done. When the helicopter landed at the base camp, the scene was unlike anything the United States military had ever seen. 480 of the most elite warriors in the world, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and special boat teams, were lined up on the tarmac in perfect formation. There was no music. There were no cameras from the press. As Lena was lowered on the litter, the men didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They didn't make a sound. Instead, as if controlled by a single mind, 480 men stood at attention and offered a slow, synchronized, silent salute. It was the highest honor a warrior could receive, a recognition of a peer who had surpassed the masters. The lieutenant who had doubted her instincts stepped forward as the medics wheeled her past. He didn't offer a handshake. He reached down and offered her his own unit patch, the highest gesture of peer-to-peer respect in the community. "I was wrong, medic," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "You weren't just support. You were the only reason any of us are standing here today. You're the anchor." Lena gave a small, tired nod, her hand closing around the patch. "Just doing the work, Lieutenant. Now, someone get me some water. I have 480 medical files to update before the end of my shift." If you believe discipline can keep someone alive even in the worst conditions, comment, "I will live better." In our modern, high-speed world, we are obsessed with the front line. We value the people who are the loudest, the people who are the most visible, the people who take up the most space in the room. We assume that importance is tied to the title you hold or the power you project onto others. We judge the strength of a system by its teeth, often forgetting that the teeth are completely useless if the body they are attached to fails to function. But the story of Lena Cross is a powerful, enduring reminder of a deeper, more profound truth. True competence is often found in the silence. It is found in the person who prepares when no one is watching. The person who understands the hidden limits of the system better than the ones who run it. Real sacrifice isn't always about losing your life in a blaze of glory. Sometimes it's about having the courage to stay behind, to hold the line, and to carry the weight that no one else wants to touch because it lacks the spotlight. Lena didn't save 480 SEALs because she was a superhero with a cape. She saved them because she was a professional with a plan. She understood that in a crisis, the most dangerous thing isn't the enemy, it's the noise of the panic. She chose to be the anchor that allowed the noise to settle, providing the calm that allowed 480 men to find their way home. In our own lives, we often ignore the medics at the hinge. We ignore the IT technicians who keep the servers running in the middle of the night. We ignore the middle managers who absorb the stress of the executives so their teams can work. We ignore the parents who stay in the background so their children can shine. But these are the people who hold the world together. They are the ones who decide whether a crisis becomes a tragedy or a triumph. When you look at the people in your own life, your colleagues, your mentors, your neighbors, the quiet experts in your community, remember the medic at the hinge. Remember that the person you might be dismissing as just support or just a background player might be the very person who is currently doing the unseen work that allows you to move forward. Respect isn't given to the loudest voice or the most followers. It is given to the character shown when the lights go out and there is no one left to watch. It is the realization that every link in the chain is vital, and sometimes the smallest, quietest link is the one that holds the entire world together. Always look deeper. Always value the quiet professional. Because one day, the valley will close in, the exit will be blocked by the storm, and you'll find yourself praying for someone like Lena Cross to stand up, hold the hinge, and wait in the dark for you. Be that anchor. Be the discipline in the storm. Be the quiet professional who knows that the truth is more important than the applause. Because in the end, it's not the one who shouts who wins the war. It's the one who is still standing when the noise stops. If you believe the people who choose to stay behind so others can move forward and deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that true strength is often quiet, disciplined, and unseen, don't forget to subscribe for more.